There are a few steps you need to follow to create your own custom entity. In this lesson, we'll implement hook schema to define our entity properties in the database, hook entity info to give entity API a little bit of information about our custom entity, and then we'll take a look at loading it using entity field query that we've already seen in a previous lesson. In this lesson, we're going to start getting our hands dirty and dive into some code that we need to create our custom video entity to display some YouTube videos. If you'd like to follow along, the code that we'll be working with will be available in the GitHub repository you can see on the screen here. To get started creating a custom video entity, we need to create a module. In order to do that, we'll start with a .info file. You can see I've stubbed one out here. It's very basic. The name of our module will be video entity, and we're going to depend on the entity contrib module. This will provide a lot of helper functions that we'll see in future lessons. In order to get our entity started, we're going to need to implement hook entity info. Hook entity info is used to describe our custom entity type to the entity API as well as field API and let it know how things like loading should work. So in our module file, let's go ahead and implement the hook. I have a few links here to Drupal.org that include some documentation about how to get started implementing your entity type. What we'll need to do here is return a descriptive array that describes the properties of our entity to the entity API. The key of the array will be the name of our entity. In this case, let's use video. The first property of the array we'll implement is label. Label will give us the human readable name that we can show in the UI for our custom entity. The second property of this array we need to implement is base table. Base table tells entity API where we're going to be storing our data for our custom entity. This is where we'll stick the entity properties that are unique to our entity and don't really have anything to do with field API. In this case, we're going to use the base table video entity underscore video. Now that we've done this, let's actually go ahead and implement that table. We'll do that using hook schema in the install file. In the install file, you can see the implementation of hook schema. We're defining one simple base table, video entity underscore video, with a few fields. The fields in this table will be the properties of our entity. We have an ID field, a name field, the embed code for the video, a created at field that will record the timestamp the entity was created, an updated at field which will record any updates, and the duration of the video. Now that we have our hook schema definition in place, when we install our module, this table will be created for us and our entity properties will be tracked correctly by entity API. There's one more piece we need to add in order to get entity API to be able to load our custom video entities. We have one more property to add to this info array, and that's entity keys. Entity keys will help field API know which field it can use when loading an entity. In this case, we're going to use the ID field. So we'll let entity API know that's the field it should use for loading. That's all there is to it. This is the minimum amount you would need to implement hook entity info and create your own custom entity type. You need a human readable label, you need an ID field that the entity controller can use for loading your entity, and you need a base table, which is where you can store your entity properties. Now that we have our custom entity created, I've gone in the database and inserted a couple of rows into our custom video entity underscore video table. Let's drop in a couple of extra hooks so we can actually see that this is working as expected. We'll start off with a hook menu implementation so that we have a page callback at /video entity that we can view our custom entity. Now that we have this page callback defined, let's go ahead and use entity load to load the video entity with ID 1 and use Crumo to print it to the screen so we can take a look and make sure that our entity is loading as expected. We've gone ahead and enabled our video entity module, so let's go ahead and hit the video entity URL and see that our entity is loading correctly. Here at the top of the screen, we can see the output from Crumo. It's loading an array. The key is 1, which is the entity ID that we said to load. Here we have the ID as well, the name, a YouTube embed code, a created at timestamp, an updated at timestamp, and a duration. Our custom entity properties are loading as expected, and it appears to be working. There's another method we could use to load our custom entity, entity field query. Let's take a look at how that could work. First, we'll create a new entity field query object. Then, as an entity condition, we'll add our custom entity type. After we've added the condition, we'll go ahead and execute the query. And again, use Crumo to print out the results. Let's go back and refresh our page. Now we can see both outputs from Crumo. The first is using regular entity load, and we can see it's the same as before. It's loading our first custom entity. The second is the result of using an entity field query. Here we have a video object that is loading all three of our entities since we didn't pass in a range. But if we take a look at the first one, we can see that we're just getting the ID. So here we can see two different ways of loading our custom entity based on the information provided in hook schema and our entity properties, and a minimal viable implementation of hook entity info used to create our custom video entity.